Hello, my name is Lukas Schmutzer. I'm a postdoctoral researcher from the University of Vienna at the Department of German Studies. In this talk, I would like to present an arts project concerned with archives and new ways to think about them. Our research partner in this is the Music and Arts University of the city of Vienna. In the classical approach towards archives, researchers go into archives, search for documents, and produce knowledge by shaping those archival records. This approach has been turned around by discourse analysis and deconstruction. Their archival turn persists that, first and foremost, archives always shape what we can recognize. As a researcher, I accompany an art project that dynamically approaches this epistemic structure. It is concerned with a provocative venture, namely the exemplary dismantling of an archive. Thus, it draws our attention to the problems of form that evolve from those relations. My talk consists of two parts. First, I would like to give a very short overview of this project. Thereafter, I would like to reflect upon what it could mean to us and to our conceptual coordinate system when we as researchers enter an archive that is set up to work against itself. The project started with those epoxy resin objects. Those are working notes cast in plastic. The documents inside are preserved and irrevocably destroyed at the same time. They put us in a paradoxical situation that imposes many thoughts. It could be coined as the exteriorization of partial forgetting, as if they would remind us of something that has been there that is now lost, like in this verse by Leonard Cohen, "I can't forget, but I don't remember what." There are 24 of those multiples, and there have been 5,800 pages of working notes. Those working notes have belonged to an Austrian artist collective called Fritzpunkt. The name is derived from the Austrian avant-garde writer Marianne Fritz. The collective was mainly inspired by Marianne Fritz's large project, The Fortress, which is about Galicia in the First World War, a centuries-long deployment soon of European and Asian armies in today's Ukraine. Here we see one of her infamous textual terrains, where traces of different languages clash. For 15 years, from 2002 to 2017, Fritzpunkt created interdisciplinary actions, installations and forms of performative and theatrical appropriation. Unintentionally, those activities led to the creation of the Fritzpunkt archive, comprised of 25 departments that covered numerous object categories, ranging from audio, video and photo storage media, handwritten working notes, concept papers, literature, props from performances, to emails and bills. It is not the archive of the writer, it is not the Marianne Fritz archive, which does also exist, but at another place. I am talking about the secondary archive of the artist collective. After the end of Fritzpunkt, there was consideration of whether its remains should be acquired by the Archive of Theatre Studies of the University of Vienna. But instead, in 2019, Fritzpunkt was transferred into another organization, into the AGFU, the Agency for Indispensability Justifications. The main goal of this agency was to perform a self-dismantling archive with the remains of Fritzpunkt. For example, there has been an erasure cinema where you could lie down in front of a projection and watch the erasure of thousands of Fritz.'s emails on a hard drive. This took many days because it was done with the most thorough method possible, the Gutmann method. As you know, when you delete a file from your hard drive, just the pointer which identifies the file is taken away, while the file's code still remains. To erase this code, the NSA recommends to overwrite the relevant binary sections 7 times. However, the Gutmann method is swiping 35 layers of O's and 1's over the section. Many people came in and said, "This is fake, right?" And we just said, "No, and it is real, and it is live." This performative installation did remind us of how data is also something that is happening, as well as it did remind us that erasure is a form of transformation from one code into another. The climax of this venture of a self-dismantling archive has taken place last summer in a former library in Vienna with an installation in 3 phases. First, the remaining objects of the Fritz. Archive were installed and open to the public for 3 days. The objects were marked by an array of white lines drawn on the floor. Just as a side note, there was a great debate among our team if the photos I am presenting to you can be justified in the context of the project. I purposely chose photos that showed details because the overall impression had to be experienced in a performative way. You could wander through as if through a landscape that allows certain paths and forbids others. Among the visitors, there were archivists who reported an urge to organize the objects. In fact, sometimes you wanted to tell all those remnants scattered on the floor, undressed as you are, without order, "Don't you have any decency?" There was a richness of potential stories just in front of our feet. Then all objects were shredded for the second phase. The shreds were put into the former place in between the white lines. Each object was exhibited again at its place in the array, but it was transformed. After that, the shreds of every object were sent to 271 archives around the world, together with a short description of the project and a request to include the object into the new archive. The amount of reactions was manageable, but the responses themselves were very diverse. This is an Instagram post from the State Archives of the German municipality of Bremen. It states that the package from the AGFU has arrived, and with an enclosed letter suggesting that the object should be considered a migrant without permit. Meanwhile, the installation was emptied except for the array on the floor. The white lines that measured the objects at first were the only traces left of them. It had the appearance of a crime scene. Thus, an archive of absence was created. Of course, archivists would debate if this was an archive at all, but it enabled an experience that concerns archival concepts in a fundamental way, since those documents that provide justifications in other contexts were cut away. Caroline Steedman argues in reference to Jacques Rancière that absence is a main concern for every historian working in an archive in 2 respects. Quote, "The status of history depends on the treatment of this twofold absence of the thing itself, that is no longer there, that is in the past, and that never was, because it never was such as it was told." Unquote. We burn to find an original thing itself in the past, but when we enter the archive, it is already absent. Nevertheless, we try to reconstruct it by aid of documents, and in doing so, we learn that it is different. It shifts, and thus we are confronted with an absence again. By reporting on the absent past, we rely on the trust of the audience in our ways of dealing with the archival objects. Those relations are brought into focus, the more the archive itself is filled with absence. This is not about objectivity versus an immanent relativism, as it was debated on the publication of Hayden White's Metahistory, where White attempted to work out the forms of historical mediation. It is about the genres and the speech genres with which history must inevitably operate, like all stories do. The emptied archive of absence, with its erased references, is the most radical occasion that points us to it. If we stand in an archive that confronts us with acts of refusal, we are forced to think about new forms of approach. Can we transfer aspects of this aesthetic experience into new archival concepts in a productive way? There are two issues to the question. On the one hand, this is a paradoxical question, since it requires a documentation of this experience, and thus an archive of the archive that was made to work against itself. On the other hand, today there are many discourses on archival concepts, and also there is a certain ditch between an accelerated society and the weary work of archivists. But every discourse on archives has to deal with an epistemic structure similar to this in addressing its absences. To outline the specificity of our approach and its potential, I will conclude with a few remarks on Derrida's archive fever. While the ACFU has set up an archive to work against itself for Derrida, this is already part of the archival structure. Derrida's paradox of archivization is derived from Sigmund Freud's labyrinthic discourse on the death drive, which is aggressive but at the same time conservative. It wants to go back to a previous state. Thus, according to Derrida, there is always violence involved. The conditions of possibility of archivization are always inscribed with violence. To stress this inevitable violence, Derrida refers to two tragic protagonists, Hamlet and Oedipus. Their conflicts with their fathers serve as a paradigm for Derrida's archival concept. Thus, he dramatizes the archive. He thinks in a scenic arrangement of how we can confront an earlier, spectral generation that shapes our ways in the world. It is psychoanalysis which showed us that this confrontation is never possible without archaic conflicts. I am particularly concerned with this double bind between the dramatization, respectively the poetical analysis as a method of deconstruction on the one hand, and the speculations of the late Freud on the other, which lead to the assumption of an archival death drive, the mal d'archive, that threatens with destruction and forgetfulness at the very same time as the conditions of possibility of archivization are inscribed. While I do not object that there is always violence involved, on the basis of the Akfos irritations, I would like to suggest to think of a plurality of forms and arrangements, instead of putting Hamlet and Oedipus exclusively at the very foundation. Could we imagine an archive in a non-patriarchal setting? Or could there also be a comedy at the core of the archive? Could there be forms of forgetting that are not destructive but productive, as a long tradition of critical thinking claims? Countering the Oedipal structure, we find not only an absence, but different types of spectrality, as well as we find an absence that is productive. Thus, absence in the archives may come with a potential, namely to address the ghosts of our past in a plurality of forms, with our future in mind.